Hi everyone, and welcome to Week 6, where we turn to the Balkans. After dispelling a dangerous assumption about the causes and consequences of mass violence in the Balkans, we proceed to lay out three general phases of genocide during the 20th century. We start with Phase 1 in the 1912-13 Balkan Wars, which was a portent of what was to come with its multiple sets of actors, all at each other's throats in a war of all against all. Then we turn to the entwined genocides of World War II, and the many different sides, and another round of war of all against all. Finally, we take a couple of theoretical side roads as we cover the third phase of mass violence during the 1990s, considering relevant ideas like the terror of history and life force atrocities. To begin, let's get situated by referring once again to Levine's map of the shifting geopolitical tectonic plates of the European rimlands. What all these regions have in common is their semi-peripheral role in the modern world system. Poverty and increasing population pressures begat persistent struggles over land, leading often to banditry, localized insurgency, and in some areas, chronic insecurity and instability. We've been using these zones to organize our syllabus over the past few weeks, albeit in a different order. But before we come back to this point, I want to start raising this dangerous intellectual trap. Here you see a cover of a popular 1993 book by American foreign affairs journalist Robert Kaplan, who argued that the Balkan Wars of the 90s were caused by a deep-seated tribal enmity. This exemplifies the ancient tribal hatreds thesis of genocide that, in turn, draws upon another, more popular idea from the early 90s about the so-called clash of civilizations. In this case, the Balkan conflicts were said to reflect the long-standing legacy of Ottoman rule and the civilizational clash between the world of Islam and European Christendom. At yet an even broader level, this trope further reflects the ideological construction of Orientalism, which refers to certain Eurocentric myths and stereotypes about Asia and the non-Western world more generally, as being exotic, devious, and barbaric. This ideological construct is especially relevant in the formation of Balkan nationalism, as both Serbian and Christian nationalisms are imagined to be front-line defenders of European Christendom against Muslim invaders. This historical/mythical narrative also tracks with contemporary discourse and right-wing extremism. In fact, Anders Breivik, who murdered 77 people in the 2011 Norway attacks, was obsessed with the Ottoman genocides against Christians, and he very much identified with the Serbian perpetrators of the Bosnian genocide. Clearly, this is a dangerous narrative, and that's what I mean by referring here to the dangers of ontology, insofar as it relates to the paranoid genocidal subjectivity, or what Dirk Moses calls the terror of history. I'll come back to this idea later. But as we hone in on our zone of genocide this week and the deeper historical context at stake, much like we saw with the Middle East and Anatolia, the legacy of mass violence in the Balkans is at least partly attributable to its geographical presence at the intersection of the Old World. Thus, we can go back to the Byzantine Empire in order to trace the roots of modern genocide. This image depicts the brutal aftermath of an 11th century battle in which the Byzantine Emperor Basil II, aka Basil the Bulgar Slayer, committed brutal atrocities against Bulgarian and Macedonian prisoners of war. Another noteworthy medieval episode was the 14th century Battle of Kosovo, where the Ottoman victory over Serbia was later mythologized by modern Serbian nationalists, providing a key ideological source of motivation in the 20th century genocides that relates to the terror of history thesis. Again, we'll come back to this. In any case, the Ottoman Empire further expanded into Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries, peaking in the 17th century, and beginning the slow process of retreat in the 18th and 19th centuries. We can see on this map how the Balkans were mostly carved up between the Habsburg and Ottoman empires. As we follow the familiar story of the European rimlands, we can trace the origins of modern genocide in the Balkans back to the systemic crisis and collapse of the inter-imperial system, leading to the turn of the 20th century and the eventual outbreak of World War I. By then, the rise of Balkan nationalisms pointed to a future of smaller, post-imperial, more ethnically homogeneous nation-states. The geopolitical map we see today reflects this historical transformation from an inter-imperial to a post-imperial international system. As with previous weeks of genocide, following Mark Levine, we thus need to understand that genocide isn't caused by ancient tribal hatreds between rival groups, as much as it is by political contest over survival and power in the dog-eat-dog world of geopolitics. As noted, our syllabus uses Levine's world systems theory of modern genocide to set up a contextualist approach, whereby we understand genocides like peaks on a mountain range that are connected by subgenocidal peaks, foothills, and valleys. I presented this slide last week, as this topographic metaphor from Bloxham and Moses works with Mark Levine's tectonic metaphor. At the risk of getting too theoretical, this graphic shows the geological phenomenon of hotspot volcanism. For example, this is how the Hawaiian island chain was formed, with this relatively stationary hotspot coming from below, causing a series of eruptions in the tectonic plates floating above the mantle. Of course, this isn't a perfect analogy, as the stationary aspect of this model doesn't make sense with nothing natural about genocide, so I don't want to sound too deterministic with this metaphor. But there's something about volcanology and seismology that can help illustrate our contextualist approach to the history of genocide. For example, think of Bloxham and Moses' peaks and valleys like spikes on a seismograph, providing a diachronic measurement of change over time. Much like radios can only detect signals against the background noise, we can't understand these peaks or spikes of genocide without setting them against the background conditions. These metaphors help set up our first learning objective, which is simply to periodize the history of genocide in the Balkans through these three phases. Conflict in the Balkans has their own respective bodies of literature, although it's important to see them together rather than as isolated. These three periods are like peaks on a mountain chain, or an island chain formed by hotspot volcanism. Or better yet, we can imagine these three periods as spikes on a seismographic reading. So let's start with Phase 1, during the pre-World War I Balkan Wars, which Levine identifies as the starting point in the crisis of the Rimlands, and an important precursor, by the way, to the Armenian genocide, due to the fact that the humiliation of Ottoman defeat and the influx of Muslim refugees led to the radicalization of Turkish nationalism. Additionally, the multi-layered violence of the Balkans, with its many different sides and shifting alliances and a veritable war of all against all, was an important prelude to the genocidal conflicts in the 1940s and 90s. As far as the Balkan Wars are concerned, the onus of violence was committed by ex-Ottoman Balkan successor states. Muslims were the majority of victims, especially in Albania under the hands of the Serbs, and in Macedonia by the Bulgarians, although there were some cases of retreating Ottoman forces massacring several hundred Greeks. Anti-civilian violence wasn't a one-way street, as there were many parties involved. For example, there were reports of atrocities on both sides between the Greeks and Bulgarians. Frankly, I'm still working out the details in this complex situation, however, is that the anti-civilian violence of the Balkan Wars signaled the logic of creative destruction and the formation of a new political order based on post-imperial, homogenizing nation-states, striving for an imagined sense of purity. We see a new modus operandi that we would later describe as ethnic cleansing, or the use of mass violence to, quote, soften up the targeted population, compelling them to leave through a systematic campaign of murder, pillaging, and raping. Now, as horrendous as the Balkan Wars certainly were, things only got much worse in the second phase, which was set in motion by the invasion of the Wehrmacht in spring 1941. The radicalized climate was set by the Nazis' intense counterinsurgency operations in Yugoslavia that were primarily directed against the communist partisans. Levine explains the big picture, as Hitler strove to do away with Yugoslavia as an entity, suppressing its Serbian center, and dishing out its various provinces to Italian, Hungarian, and Bulgarian partners, or in the case of Slovenia, directly sharing out the proceeds between the Reich and Rome. The Nazis found willing accomplices with the Croatian fascist terroristic organization, the Ustashi, who were installed by the Nazis as a puppet regime known as the NDH. The NDH willingly collaborated with the Nazis in rounding Jews, who were a minority of the population anyways, but their primary targets were the Serbs. Recalling our earlier reference to Orientalism, Croat nationalist mythology depicts itself as defenders of Western civilization on the boundaries with the East, and that included the Serbs. So from late 1941 to early 42, the Ustashi set up and ran a concentration camp complex known as Jasenovac, which has since become a symbol of Serbian victimization, and rightly so, given the estimated 200,000 plus Serbs killed during World War II. Next, as we move through this cast of characters, the Serbian royalist movement known as the Chetniks were ideologically the mirror image of the Ustashi. They were both ultranationalist and staunchly anti-communist, although they were, of course, antagonists on opposite sides of Axis rule. The Chetniks rejected the ideal of brotherhood and unity amongst Southern Slavs and instead aimed to create an ethnically homogenized and consolidated Serbian nation-state. As such, they waged anti-civilian violence against all non-Serbs, including Jews, Croatians, Slovenes, and especially Muslims. Indeed, Serbian animus against Muslims was particularly widespread. The Muslims had been the primary targets in the first phase of genocide during the Balkan Wars, as they were left defenseless ever since the Ottomans left. It is true that in 1943, the SS created a division of Bosnian Muslims, albeit only under the command of staff comprised of Croats and ethnic Germans, but that was only well after the Muslims had suffered the brunt of genocide. Finally, the communist partisans were one of Europe's most effective anti-Axis half-Slovene ex-Habsburg army officer, Josip Tito. The partisans envisioned a pan-Yugoslav federation led by a Bolshevik-style regime, but they had their own skeletons in the closet. In fact, Tito's regime was ruthless in carrying out retributive violence towards the end of the war and immediately after, starting with the ethnic Germans. In one of our assigned readings from Levine this week, he talks about the broader process of post-war ethnic cleansing of Germans in the immediate wake of World War II. In Yugoslavia alone, an estimated 64,000 ethnic Germans were murdered by the partisans, and over 150,000 were interned in camps where they awaited eventual deportation. Also, several thousand Hungarians were massacred, and ethnic Italians were forcibly removed. Additionally, the communists also targeted the Ustashi and Slovene POWs, as Tito cracked down on nationalist movements that threatened the post-war multinational federal government of Yugoslavia, which was made up of these 6 republics that included 2 autonomous provinces, including Kosovo, thereby playing into the Serbs' simmering ethnic grievances related to the terror of history idea. It was generally the case in post-war socialist Yugoslavia that ethnic tensions were mostly repressed, not resolved, so that by the time of Tito's death in 1980, which was followed by a period of economic downturn, ethnic politics returned with a vengeance. This was especially the case with Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic, who riled up Serbian nationalists with an infamous 1989 speech at the memorial grounds of the Battle of Kosovo, which, as I said before, had become a centerpiece in Serbian while the Croatian fascist record during World War II was largely sanitized by the Croatian nationalist leader Franjo Tudjman, whose historical revisionism notoriously whitewashed over the legacy of war crimes. Now, recall this slide from week 5 of Underpinnings, when we tried to understand the logic of the perpetrator's hallucinatory worldview involving a perverse role reversal. This is the perpetrator-victim paradox, whereby perpetrators don't see themselves as perpetrators. Instead, their victims are imagined to be the quote-unquote real perpetrators. The concept of subaltern genocide articulates this imaginary role reversal, insofar as the perpetrator's subjectivity is often driven by a sense of an ostensibly oppressed group seeking to gain revenge and liberation by waging genocide against their oppressors. Now, of course, there's a vast gulf between the objective reality and subjective perception, but we have to try to understand the hallucinatory worldview involved with the genocidal subjectivity. This is especially relevant to the formation of the genocidal subjectivity amongst Serbian nationalists, which, as noted, was built around what Dirk Moses identifies as the terror of history, or a sense of existential anxiety driven by a legacy of unresolved collective trauma. I've already mentioned how the 14th century Battle of Kosovo loomed large in Serbian nationalism, which portrayed itself as valiant defenders of Christendom against the invasive forces of Islam. Combined with recent experiences of genocidal victimization, particularly during World War II, there was, and still is, quite frankly, a certain paranoia that the Muslims are going to demographically overwhelm the Serbs, especially in the province of Kosovo. This was the argument behind the infamous 1986 memorandum that was drawn up by the Serbian Academy of Sciences and Arts, which claimed that, quote, the physical, political, legal, and cultural genocide perpetrated against the Serbian population of Kosovo is the greatest defeat suffered by Serbia in modern history. We'll see a parallel with this in week 8 when we consider the 1957 Bahutu Manifesto on Rwanda. And like we saw last week with the Nazis, protecting Serbian minority rights was the pretext for Serbian intervention in neighboring republics. In order to exemplify what Levine calls the perpetrator negotiator during the trial of Radovan Karadzic, where the negotiator recalls how this infamous perpetrator was waging a preemptive genocide as a means of self-defense in an existential conflict, Thus, we have the counterintuitive and admittedly controversial argument that genocidal subjectivities are often driven by their own hallucinatory sense of genocide prevention. Okay, the next few slides are from my old presentation and still need to be cleaned up. Here's a simple fact sheet that helps us understand the multiple conflicts involved with a third wave of genocidal violence. Although I need to revise this for next time in order to highlight as the newly reunified Germany broke with the European community, as it was then called, by backing Croatia and Slovenia. Then there was the meandering role of the US and NATO. Don't worry about this aspect of learning objective number 7, as it really isn't covered in the readings. This is mostly a note for next time. Likewise, I may have to adjust this lecture with a topic that we covered at the end of week 4, as the third wave of genocide in the Balkans coincided with the renewal of violence in the Caucasus. I need to pretty this slide up as well, but you have the basic facts. And then there's this slide, which definitely needs to be cleaned up, and a chapter in this edited volume on the anthropology of genocide that speaks to the manufacturing of difference in the Balkans. I'll include this in the supplementary readings. Also, I make a note up here at the top about the problems with the term ethnic cleansing. I don't want to get too bogged down in the definitional debate, but this is something we can definitely come back to in the discussion forum. Likewise, although this slide isn't part of our learning objectives, it does point to the conceptual issues at stake. On the one hand, the rhetoric surrounding the Bosnian genocide was very much influenced by concurrent developments in Holocaust memory, especially in the US, where the opening of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum and the aid and intuitive framework for stressing the ethical significance of genocide, although analytically, this representational framework is problematic. Again, I can discuss this further on Moodle. The same goes for the second point too, about the legal quandary involved with applying the G word during the costly proceedings of the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia. But we need to close with our final learning objective, which once again returns to the concept of life force atrocities, to understand how genocide targets the family unit. Reading 5 thus directs our attention to the so-called RAM plan, which was a strategy drawn up by Serbian leaders, especially young women, and using systemic rape to terrorize a population as a means of compelling forced removals. We confront this paradox of genocidal rape, insofar as sexual reproduction can actually, yet counterintuitively, be a means of group destruction, especially in terms of causing mental and bodily harm, as well as by inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its destruction. This, of course, recalls our discussion from week 1 of underpinnings, especially Claudia Card's notion of genocide as social death. Thus, to wrap up, I invite some respondents on the discussion forum to pick up this theme and help us flesh out the implications. As usual, we have our next steps. As always, reach out to me if you have any questions. Thanks for listening, and I'll